The Battle of Manzikert was the most devastating defeat in Byzantine history. The Byzantines were fully aware of its significance. Their historians repeatedly referred to that terrible day. To the crusaders who came later, it seemed the Byzantines had lost their right to be called defenders of Christendom. Manzikert became a justification for Western intervention. Despite their victory, the Turks didn't take full advantage of the situation right away. Alp Arslan had achieved what he wanted. His eastern flank was secure, and the threat of a Byzantine alliance with the Fatimids was removed. From the captured Byzantine emperor, he only demanded the withdrawal from Armenia and a large ransom. After that, he left for another campaign in Central Asia, where he died in 1072. His son, Malik Shah, who would go on to rule an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the borders of China, never personally entered Asia Minor. However, his Turkoman followers began moving in. Malik Shah had no interest in settling them in the core lands of the Caliphate, but the open plains of Anatolia, abandoned and turned into grazing lands by the Byzantine elite, were ideal. He tasked his cousin Suleiman ibn Kutalmish with conquering the region for the Turks. The Byzantines made conquest easy. Over the next 20 years, their empire was engulfed in rebellion and political chaos. When news of the disaster and the emperor's capture reached Constantinople, his stepson, Michael Ducas, declared himself ruler. The arrival of his cousin Andronicus with the surviving army solidified his position. An cultured young man who, in better times, might have been a capable ruler. But the crises that followed were beyond him. When Emperor Romanus Diogenes returned from captivity, he found himself dethroned. He tried to fight back, but was quickly defeated and captured. His captors blinded him so severely that he died soon after. Michael couldn't risk leaving him alive. However, Romanus's noble relatives and the many who admired his bravery were outraged, and that resentment would soon lead to betrayal. Serious Turkish invasions of Asia Minor began in 1073. These were not organized campaigns. Suleiman aimed to establish a proper sultanate under Malik Shah's authority. But other Turkish warlords, such as Danish Menchaka, Skada Menga Cheksot, only to seize strongholds from which they could rule as petty rulers. Behind them came the Turkoman nomads, lightly armed and traveling with their families, seeking pasture in the uplands. Christians fled ahead of them, leaving behind burned villages and stolen livestock. The Turkomans generally avoided cities, but the destruction they left behind disrupted communication and isolated provinces. This made it easier for Turkish leaders to follow their own agendas. Their presence would ultimately make any Byzantine attempt at reconquest nearly impossible. Emperor Michael tried to resist the Turkish advance. One of his few surviving units after Manzikert was led by the Norman commander Roussel of Behlul. Though Roussel had proven untrustworthy, Michael had little choice but to rely on him. Roussel was given command alongside a young Byzantine general, Alexius Comnenus, the nephew of a former emperor. Isaac and his brother Alexius, despite their family's rivalry with the Ducas clan, remained loyal to Michael. However, Roussel betrayed the empire. Before the army even encountered the Turks, he broke ranks and went rogue. Isaac, caught between Turkish and Norman forces, was overwhelmed and captured. Roussel revealed his true ambitions. He intended to establish a Norman state in Anatolia, inspired by his fellow Normans in southern Italy. Though he had only 3,000 men, they were elite soldiers, stronger than any local troops. Michael now viewed Roussel as a greater threat than the Turks. He sent his uncle, Caesar John Ducas, to confront him, but Roussel defeated and captured him. Claiming legitimacy, Roussel declared his prisoner the new emperor and marched toward Constantinople. Reaching the Bosphorus, he burned the suburb of Chrysopolis and camped in its ruins in desperation. Michael turned to Suleiman for help. In exchange for control of eastern Anatolia, Suleiman agreed to assist. Roussel was defeated on Mount Sophon, but escaped and fled north to Amasya. Michael then sent Alexius Comnenus, who managed to turn a key Turkish leader against Roussel. Leading to his capture, Roussel had been so respected that the people of Amasya tried to save him until they heard he had been blinded. In truth, Alexius couldn't bring himself to blind him. Michael was pleased to hear he hadn't. Roussel vanished from history after that. But the episode left a deep impression. The Byzantines learned the Normans could not be trusted and had imperial ambitions of their own. This distrust later shaped Byzantine foreign policy. From then on, Normans were kept out of imperial service, and even their Scandinavian relatives were viewed with suspicion. The famous Varangian Guard was now filled with Anglo-Saxons from Britain, who had fought and suffered under the Normans. Michael's fear of the Normans and his reliance on foreign mercenaries led him to pursue peace with the West. Southern Italy was lost, and he couldn't afford further conflict. He sent the philosopher John Attalus as an ambassador to the Normans. While many believed Attalus had betrayed imperial interests, Michael was satisfied, proposed a marriage between Guiscard's daughter Helen and his young son Constantine. He also secured the friendship of Pope Gregory VII. His diplomacy kept peace in the West, but in Anatolia, things fell apart. The government lost control. Some loyal generals like Alexius Comnenus in Antioch held out, but communication broke down, and there was no unified strategy. In 1078, the governor of Central Asia Minor, Nicephorus Bottinus, rebelled partly from personal ambition, partly out of frustration with Michael's weakness. Lacking an army, he recruited large numbers of Turks and used them to seize cities en route to the capital. For the first time, Turkish troops entered major western Anatolian cities, though they were technically Bottinus's allies. Removing them would not be easy. Michael offered no resistance and withdrew to a monastery, where he found a true calling. He eventually became an archbishop. His wife, Maria of Alania, known for her beauty, offered herself to the new emperor. But Nicephorus soon found ruling more difficult than rebelling. More generals followed his example. In the Western Balkans, Nicephorus Bryennius declared himself emperor. Alexius Comnenus was sent to stop him with only a small army of poorly trained Greeks and some Franks who, true to form, deserted. Only with the help of Turkish mercenaries did he defeat Bryennius. No sooner was that over than he had to put down another revolt in Thessaly. Meanwhile, the Turkish garrison in Nicaea revolted. Pope Gregory excommunicated Bottinus after Michael's fall, and Guiscard, angered by his daughter's broken engagement, prepared an invasion. He landed in Avlona and marched on Dyrrhachium. In the same season, the governor of Asia, Nicephorus Melissenus, also rebelled and allied with Suleiman. This allowed Suleiman to march into Bithynia unopposed, where the Turkish garrisons welcomed him. When Melissenus failed to take Constantinople, Suleiman refused to return the cities. Instead, he established his capital in Nicaea's sacred Christian city, just 100 miles from Constantinople, which now became the heart of the Turkish Sultanate. In Constantinople, Emperor Nicephorus ruined his only real chance of holding on to power by alienating the Comnenus family. Isaac and Alexius Comnenus had served him faithfully and tried to maintain good relations with the empress. Isaac had married her cousin. Alexius was rumored to be her lover. The empress couldn't control the political scheming at court, which eventually turned Nicephorus against the brothers. Fearing for their safety, Isaac and Alexius had no choice but to rebel. The family agreed that Alexius was the more capable of the two, so he was declared emperor. Nicephorus was overthrown as easily as the emperor he had previously deposed. Following the patriarch's advice, he stepped down, weary and humiliated, and retired to a monastery to live out his final days as a monk. Alexius Comnenus would go on to rule for 37 years and become the greatest statesman of his generation. But in the year 1081, it seemed unlikely that either he or the Byzantine Empire would survive. He was a young man, likely not yet 30, but he had gained valuable experience as a military commander. Often forced to succeed with limited resources and relying on his intelligence and diplomacy. He was not tall, but had a strong and dignified presence. His demeanor was calm and gracious, and he showed remarkable self-control. He combined a kind nature with a pragmatic willingness to use deception or fear when necessary for the good of the empire. At that point, his only real advantages were his personal strength and the loyalty of his troops. His extended family had connections across the Byzantine nobility, which helped him rise to power. And he further solidified his position by marrying into the Dukas family. However, the jealousies and rivalries within his own family, particularly the hostility his controlling mother felt toward his wife and her relatives, created more difficulties. The court was full of former emperors, relatives, and descendants of past or potential usurpers, and Alexius tried to secure their loyalty through marriage alliances. He betrothed his eldest daughter, Anna, to Constantine Ducas, son of the former Empress Maria, who was bitterly jealous of his new empress, Irene. He married his sister Theodora to one of Romanus Diogenes' sons. After Constantine Ducas's death, Anna married the son of Nicephorus Brionius. Another sister, Eudocia, was already married to Nicephorus Melicinus, who gave up his claim to the throne in exchange for the title of Caesar. Alexius had to keep all of these figures under careful watch, constantly diffusing their rivalries and preventing betrayal. A new and elaborate hierarchy of titles was introduced to appease their ambitions. The nobility and high-ranking officials were just as untrustworthy. Conspiracies were constantly being uncovered, and assassination threats loomed over Alexius. Yet, by both nature and strategy, he tended to be lenient in his punishments. His calm and far-sighted decision-making stood out all the more considering the constant personal danger he lived with in 1081. The empire's condition was so desperate that only someone incredibly brave or incredibly foolish would have dared to rule it. The treasury was empty. Previous emperors had spent recklessly, and the loss of Anatolia, along with revolts in Europe, had drastically reduced state income. The old tax system had collapsed. Alexius was no expert in finance, and his methods would horrify any modern economist. Still, he managed by imposing heavy taxes, demanding forced loans, confiscating wealth from aristocrats and the church, fining people instead of imprisoning them, selling privileges, and expanding palace-run industries. With this, he rebuilt the army and navy, kept up a luxurious court, and gave generous gifts to loyal subjects and foreign dignitaries. He understood that in the East, a ruler's prestige depended entirely on grandeur. Stinginess was an unforgivable flaw. However, Alexius made two critical mistakes. First, in return for immediate support, he gave foreign merchants trade privileges that harmed the interests of his own people. Second, at a crucial moment, he devalued the imperial currency, which for 7 centuries had been one of the most stable in the world. In foreign affairs, the situation was even worse, if the word foreign still applied, as enemies had already infiltrated the empire from all directions. In Europe, the Byzantines clung to the Balkans, but the Slavs in Serbia and Dalmatia were in open revolt. The Pecheneg tribes from beyond the Danube were launching regular raids across the river. In the west, Robert Guiscard and the Normans had taken Avlona and were besieging Dyrrha Shim. In Asia, the Byzantines had little left, only parts of the Black Sea coastline, few isolated cities along the southern coast, and the heavily fortified city of Antioch. Even those areas were barely connected to the central government. A few cities in the interior remained under Christian control, but they were cut off and acted independently. Most of Anatolia was under the rule of the Seljuk Sultan Suleiman, who governed from Nicaea and held territory stretching from the Bosphorus to Syria. However, his state lacked a solid administrative system and fixed borders. Other Turkish warlords controlled different cities. Some recognized Suleiman's authority, but most pledged allegiance only to Malik Shah. Among them, the most prominent were the Danishman family in Caesarea, Sebastia, and Amasea, Minga, Kik, in Erzincan and Colonnea, and the most dangerous Chaka, who had seized Smyrna and the Aegean coast. These Turkish rulers maintained some level of order in their cities, but the countryside was still plagued by nomadic Turkoman tribes. Waves of Greek and Armenian refugees added to the instability. Many Christians converted to Islam and gradually assimilated into Turkish society. A few Greek communities remained in the mountains, and a group of Christian Turks who had lived for centuries around Caesarea managed to keep their identity and faith into modern times. Most Greeks, however, fled to the Black Sea or Aegean coasts. The Armenians, on the other hand, migrated in a more structured way. Many Armenian nobles who had lost their lands to the Byzantines had already been resettled in southern Cappadocia. Near the Taurus Mountains, when the Seljuk invasions intensified, more Armenians moved south to join them. Eventually, nearly half the population of Armenia migrated to these new colonies. As the Turks advanced through Cappadocia, the Armenians moved further into the Taurus and Anti-Taurus mountains and into the middle Euphrates Valley, which had not yet fallen to the Turks. The vacated areas were soon filled, not by Turks, but by Muslim Kurds coming from Assyria and northwestern Iran, the last prince of the ancient Bagratid dynasty, which traced its lineage back to King David, was killed on Byzantine orders in 1079, after he had committed a particularly brutal murder of the Archbishop of Caesarea. One of his relatives, Rupin, then rebelled against the empire and established himself in the mountains of northwestern Cilicia. Around the same time, another Armenian leader, Ashin, son of Hethum, created a similar stronghold slightly to the west. These two dynasties, the Rupinians and the Hethumians, would play roles in future history, but at the time their influence was overshadowed by a powerful Armenian leader named Varam, known to the Byzantines as Philaretus. Philaretus had served the Byzantine Empire and had been appointed governor of Germanatia, modern-day Marash, by Romanus Diogenes. When Romanus fell from power, Philaretus refused to recognize Michael Ducas and declared his independence. During the chaos of Michael's reign, he seized the major cities of Cilicia, Tarsus, Mamastra, and Anazarbus, captured Edessa after a 6-month siege in 1078. The people of Antioch, whose governor had just been assassinated, asked Philaretus to take control of the city to protect it. From the Turks, his realm now extended from Tarsus to beyond the Euphrates, and both Rupin and Ashin became his vassals. Yet Philaretus remained uneasy. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he followed Orthodox Christianity and didn't want to fully sever ties with the Byzantine Empire. After Michael's abdication, he declared loyalty to Nicephorus Botanus, who allowed him to remain as governor. Of his conquered lands, Philaretus also seemed to recognize Alexius Comnenus, but, as a safeguard, paid tribute to the Arab rulers of Aleppo as well. When Alexius took the throne, he had to decide which of his many enemies to confront first. He calculated that the Turks, though dangerous, would require a long and sustained campaign to defeat. He was not yet prepared for that. He also believed they would soon turn on each other, buying him time. The more immediate threat, he decided, came from the Normans. But the Norman War lasted longer than he expected. In the summer of 1081, Robert Guiscard, accompanied by his formidable wife, Sigilgita of Salerno, and his son Bohemond, laid siege to the important coastal fortress of Dyrrhachium. In October, Alexius led an army to relieve the city. Troops included the Anglo-Saxon Varangian Guard, exiles from England, who had fled after the Battle of Hastings. But, just as at Hastings, they were no match for the heavily armored Norman knights. Alexius suffered a crushing defeat. Although Dyrrhachium held out through the winter. It eventually fell in February 1082. With the fortress under Norman control, Robert advanced eastward along the Via Egnatia, the main road leading toward Constantinople. However, political troubles in Italy forced him to return home. He left the campaign in the hands of his son Bohemond, who continued operations in Macedonia and Greece. Bohemond repeatedly defeated Alexius, pushing the empire to the brink. The emperor had to turn to the Turks for manpower and to the Venetians for naval support. The Venetian fleet disrupted Norman supply lines, while Turkish reinforcements helped Alexius recapture Thessaly. In 1083, Bohemond withdrew to Italy, but he returned the next year with his father. Together, they defeated the Venetian navy off the island of Corfu. The war finally came to an end in 1085, when Robert Guiscard died on the island of Cephalonia, and his sons began to fight over his inheritance. With the Norman threat removed, Alexius was finally able to reassert his authority over the empire's European provinces. But the long distraction had cost the empire dearly in the east. During those 4 years, the Byzantine hold over the eastern provinces had collapsed. Floridas, the Armenian warlord, who once ruled a vast domain in Cilicia and northern Syria, became entangled in Turkish politics and made fatal miscalculations. In early 1085, his own son betrayed Antioch to the Seljuk Sultan Suleiman. Along with Antioch, the rest of Philoridas's cities in Cilicia fell to the Turks. 2 years later, 1087, the important city of Edessa was captured by a Turkish chieftain named Busan. However, it was retaken in 1094 by Theros, an Armenian noble and former vassal of the Seljuks, who ruled with the help of a Turkish garrison initially placed to keep him in check. Meanwhile, Melitene, modern-day Malatya, was seized by Theros's father-in-law Gabriel, another Armenian leader who, like Theros, followed the Orthodox Christian faith. Tensions between the Orthodox Church and the rival Jacobite and Armenian churches increased, adding to the instability in the region. For many of these non-Orthodox Christians, the collapse of Byzantine power was welcomed. They preferred the rule of the Muslim Turks, who in many cases treated them more tolerantly. In southern Syria, Seljuk control had become firmly established. Since 1055, when the Seljuk leader Tughril Bey had entered Baghdad, the Fatimid rulers of Syria had been under threat. The situation caused unrest, rebellion, and political fragmentation. As early as 1056, Byzantine officials at Laodike had refused entry to a Latin Christian bishop, not out of hostility, but because they knew that Syria was unsafe for Christian pilgrims. Later events proved them right. In 1071, the same year as the disaster at Manzikert and the fall of Byzantine Bari, in Italy a Turkish commander named Atsiz ibn Abak, nominally a vassal of the Seljuk ruler Alparslan, captured Jerusalem without resistance and swiftly occupied all of Palestine down to the fortress of Ashkelon. By 1075, he had seized Damascus as well. The next year, the Fatimids briefly regained Jerusalem, but Atsiz retook it after a brutal siege and massacre of the Muslim population. Interestingly, the Christian inhabitants protected within the cities, Christian quarter were left unharmed. Despite this victory, Atsiz faced new threats. The Fatimids began attacking his holdings in Damascus, forcing him to call for help from Tudosh, the brother of Malik Shah, who had ambitions to carve out his own Seljuk Sultanate in Syria. In 1079, Tudosh killed Atsiz and took over his territories. His rule stretched from Aleppo to Egypt's borders. Together with his military commander Ortak, who governed Jerusalem, Tudosh brought a period of stability to the region. Christians were not actively persecuted. Still, the Orthodox Patriarch of Jerusalem spent most of his time in Constantinople, and the Patriarch of Antioch relocated there as well. By 1085, with the Norman threat behind him, Alexius could finally turn his focus back to the Turks. Until then, he had survived by manipulating the rivalries between various Turkish princes and endless game of intrigue, diplomacy, and bribery. Now, combining military strength with political cunning, he negotiated a treaty that returned the city of Nicomedia and the Marmara coast to Byzantine. Fortune favored Alexius further the next year. After capturing Antioch, Suleiman marched on Aleppo, whose Arab ruler turned to Tutosh for help. In the battle that followed outside the city, Tutosh defeated Suleiman and killed him. Suleiman's death plunged the Turks in Anatolia into disarray, an ideal situation for Alexius. He skillfully exploited their divisions, pitting one warlord against another, offering promises of rewards and marriage alliances. The city of Nicaea, a key stronghold, was held for 6 years by a rebel named Abul Kazim. But in 1092, Malik Shah removed him and installed Suleiman's son, Kilajarslan I, as ruler. While the Turks quarreled, Alexius used the opportunity to strengthen his grip. Progress was slow and difficult. The only city he managed to reclaim outright was Cyzicus. Worse, he couldn't stop the Danishmends from expanding westward into Paphlagonia, capturing his family's ancestral home. Kastamuni, back home, palace conspiracies continued to trouble him. Then, in 1087, he faced a major external threat, a large-scale invasion from the north. The Pechenegs, supported by Hungary, crossed the Danube. It took years of diplomacy and one overwhelming military victory in 1091 for Alexius to finally end the barbarian threat from the north. With the deaths of both Suleiman and Chaka, Emperor Alexius could now consider a more assertive foreign policy. He had stabilized his rule in Constantinople, and the European provinces were relatively peaceful. His navy had been rebuilt and was now highly effective, and for the time being his treasury was well stocked. But there was a major obstacle. His army remained small. With most of Anatolia lost, he had few native troops available. What he needed most were trained foreign mercenaries. Around the year 1095, there were signs that Seljuk power was weakening. Malik Shah, the great Seljuk Sultan who had kept the sprawling Turkish domains loosely unified, died in 1092. His death triggered a bitter civil war among his young sons. For the next decade, the Turks were preoccupied with their own internal conflict, trying to divide their inheritance. During this time, Arab and Kurdish warlords gained power in Iraq. In Syria, things deteriorated further. After Tuch's death in 1095, his sons Ridwan in Aleppo and Dukak in Damascus proved unable to govern effectively or maintain order. In Jerusalem, control passed to the sons of Ortok. Their rule was weak and oppressive. The Orthodox Patriarch, Simeon, along with the senior clergy, abandoned the city and took refuge in Cyprus. Meanwhile, in Tripoli, a Shiite family, the Banu Amor, declared their independence and established a principality of their own. The Fatimids of Egypt began retaking parts of southern Palestine. In the north, a Turkish general named Kerboga, the Atabag military governor of Mosul, under the nominal authority of the Abbasid Caliph, slowly began to expand his influence into Ridwan's territory to contemporary observers and travelers. The region appeared completely fragmented. Every city seemed to be under a different ruler. And yet, remarkably, Christian pilgrims from the West continued to travel to the Holy Land despite the chaos. While pilgrimage had never fully stopped, it had become an extremely difficult journey. Till Ortok's death, Christian life in Jerusalem was relatively undisturbed. In fact, outside of times when Egyptian and Turkish forces were fighting in the region, Palestine was often calm. Anatolia had become nearly impassable unless travelers were accompanied by armed guards, and even then, danger was constant. Ongoing wars, rival rulers, and unpredictable checkpoints frequently delayed or endangered the journey. Syria was not much better. Bandits roamed the roads, and nearly every small town had a local warlord demanding taxes from passing travelers. Those pilgrims who did manage to reach Jerusalem returned to Europe exhausted and impoverished. They brought back grim stories of danger, extortion, and hardship which spread quickly and stirred mounting anger and anxiety in the Christian West. A Christian citizen faces a fundamental dilemma. Is it right for him to fight for his country? Christianity is a religion founded on peace, yet war brings only death and destruction. The early church fathers had no hesitation on the matter. They viewed war simply as mass murder. However, once Christianity triumphed and the Roman Empire transformed into Christendom, the question arose, shouldn't its citizens now be willing to bear arms for its protection? The Eastern Church disagreed. St. Basil, one of its foremost canonists, acknowledged that soldiers were obligated to follow orders. It still believed that anyone who killed in war should abstain from receiving communion for 3 years as a sign of repentance, though this was a strict view and not fully enforced. Byzantine soldiers were not treated as murderers. Their role carried no special honor. Dying in battle was not seen as glorious, nor was it considered martyrdom to fall in combat against non-believers. A true martyr, in their view, died armed only with faith. Fighting non-Christians was regrettable, even if sometimes necessary. Engaging in conflict with fellow Christians was even worse. Indeed, Byzantine history is notably devoid of aggressive wars. Justinian's campaigns aimed to free Roman citizens from heretical barbarian rulers. Basil II's wars against the Bulgarians sought to reclaim imperial territory and eliminate a threat to Constantinople. The Byzantines consistently preferred peaceful solutions, even if it meant resorting to complex diplomacy or paying tributes. To Western historians, used to admiring military bravery, Byzantine tactics often appear cowardly or deceptive. Usually, their actions were driven by a sincere desire to avoid bloodshed. Anna Komnena, a quintessential Byzantine princess and historian, made it clear in her writings that although she took great interest in military matters and admired her father's battlefield accomplishments, she regarded war as shameful a last resort and ultimately a sign that all other options had failed. In contrast, the Western perspective was less restrained. St. Augustine had acknowledged that wars could be commanded by God. Western society, shaped by barbarian invasions, naturally sought to justify its embrace of warfare. The emerging code of chivalry, supported by popular epics, glorified the military hero, while those who promoted peace fell into lasting disfavor. Faced with this cultural momentum, the Church found itself unable to suppress the urge for war. Instead, it sought to redirect this aggressive energy toward causes that served its own interests. Thus, the idea of a holy war fought on behalf of the Church became not only acceptable, but even praiseworthy.
Wow.
Pope Leo IV declared that those who died defending the Church would be rewarded in heaven. A few years later, Pope John VIII went further, proclaiming that such fallen warriors were martyrs, that their sins would be forgiven if they died in battle. However, he emphasized that soldiers should be pure of heart. Pope Nicholas I added that those under church discipline for their sins should not take up arms unless it was to fight non-believers, although the highest church authorities in the West did not outright condemn warfare. There were still voices that found it deeply troubling. One such figure was Bruno of Querfurt, a German missionary who was later martyred by pagan Prussians in 1009. He was appalled by the violent conflicts waged by the emperors of his time, such as Otto II's war against the French king and Henry II's campaign against the Poles, especially because these were wars between Christians. By then, peace movement had already begun to take root in France. In 989, at the Council of Charroux, bishops from Aquitaine gathered to defend the rights and safety of the clergy and proposed that the Church should also guarantee peace for the poor. The following year, at the Council of Le Puy, this idea gained even stronger support. Guy of Anjou, the Bishop of Le Puy, declared that without peace, no one could truly see the Lord. He urged everyone to become sons of peace. A few years later, William the Great, Duke of Aquitaine, expanded on these ideas. At the Council of Poitiers in the year 1000, a decree was issued that disputes should be resolved through justice rather than violence, and those who defied this principle would face excommunication. William and his noblemen pledged their support. King Robert the Pious of France implemented a similar measure within his own territories. Initially, Church's main goal in supporting this peace movement was to protect its own lands and property from the destruction and theft that came with warfare. To enforce this, a series of church councils were held. At Verdun-sur-le-Doubs in 1016, a formal oath was created, in which nobles pledged not to force clergy or peasants into their armies, not to plunder crops, and not to seize livestock. This vow was widely taken across France, with crowds of clergy and lay people shouting peace, peace, peace in unison. Buoyed by these early successes, some enthusiastic church leaders decided to push the movement even further. In 1038, Aymon, the Archbishop of Bourges, commanded that every Christian over the age of 15 declare himself an enemy of those who broke the peace, and be ready to take up arms against them if necessary. Leagues of peace were formed, and initially proved effective. However, the second part of the Archbishop's order encouraging armed actions soon became more popular than the first. Groups of armed peasants, often led by clergy, began attacking the castles of rebellious nobles. This spontaneous militia quickly grew unruly and destructive, prompting the authorities to intervene. The situation came to a head when a large League of Peace burned down the village of Benicy. In response, Count Odo of Deals defeated the group. Along the banks of the Cher River, the aftermath was tragic. Reportedly, as many as 700 clergy members were killed in the battle. At the same time, more practical steps were being taken to limit warfare. In 1027, Aliba, the Bishop of Vich, convened a synod at Tumultuous in the region of Roussillon, where it was decreed that no fighting should take place during the Sabbath hours. This concept, placing restrictions on warfare during sacred times, soon expanded, influenced by the powerful Abbot Odilo of Cluny. The bishops of Provence sent a letter in 1041 to the Church in Italy, asking that the truce of God be extended to cover additional holy days, such as Good Friday, Holy Saturday, and Ascension Day. Aquitaine had already adopted similar measures. Burgundy went even further, declaring that the truce would begin on Wednesday evening and last until Monday morning. They also included the entire Advent season, the period from Christmas to the Sunday after Epiphany, as well as Lent, Holy Week, and the week following Easter in 1042. William the Conqueror issued laws for Normandy that added the days from the Rogation period to the week after Pentecost. By 1050, Council at Toulouse recommended that the major feast days of the Virgin Mary and other saints also be included under the Truce of God. By the middle of the 11th century, the Truce of God was widely recognized, and the Church began combining it with the earlier Peace of God movement, which aimed to shield church property and the poor from violence. Both were enforced under threat of excommunication. The Council of Narbonne in 1054 made it clear no Christian should kill another Christian. Such an act was seen as shedding the blood of Christ. Asterisk still. Peace movements often look better in theory than in practice, and this was no different. In the 11th century, many of the same rulers who championed the Truce of God did not follow its rules. William the Conqueror, for example, fought the Christian King Harold at Hastings on a Saturday, a day supposedly covered by the truce. Anna Comnena later wrote with horror about how, while the Byzantine Church tried earnestly to avoid warfare, on holy days, Western knights had attacked Constantinople during Holy Week, with even priests among their armed ranks. Even the popes recognized that church lands were never truly safe from lay aggression. The aggressive spirit of the West and its obsession with military glory couldn't be easily extinguished. As a result, church leaders found it more effective to return to an older strategy, channeling this violent energy into wars against Nandash Christians, to Western Europeans. The Muslim threat felt far more urgent than it did to the Byzantines, at least until the arrival of the Turks. The Turks were seen by Byzantines more as barbarians than as enemies of the faith. Ever since the Arabs failed to capture Constantinople in the early 8th century, warfare on the empire's eastern border had been ongoing, but not severe enough to threaten its survival. These conflicts rarely disrupted trade or cultural exchange. In fact, the Arabs, like the Byzantines, were inheritors of Greco-Roman civilization. Their lifestyles were surprisingly similar. A Byzantine would have felt far more comfortable in cities like Cairo or Baghdad than in Western places like Paris, Goslar, or even Rome. Outside of occasional crises and acts of retaliation, both the Byzantine Empire and the Caliphate typically respected each other's religions. Forced conversions were rare, and both sides generally allowed freedom of worship. Though Muslim rulers sometimes boasted and demanded tribute, the events of the late 10th century had proven that the Byzantine state remained a strong and well-organized opponent. Western Christians did not share the tolerance or sense of security that characterized their Byzantine counterparts. While they were proud to be Christians and saw themselves as the heirs of Rome, many were also uncomfortably aware that, in many ways, Muslim civilization was more advanced than their own. Muslim power dominated much of the Western Mediterranean, stretching from Catalonia to Tunis. Muslim pirates attacked Christian ships, and Rome itself had been sacked by Muslim forces. Fortified Muslim outposts were established in parts of Italy and Provence, and their strongholds in Spain posed a continual threat. It seemed entirely possible that they could once again surge over the Pyrenees and invade France. At the time, Western Christendom lacked the organizational strength to defend itself against such a threat. Individual heroes had managed to repel Saracen raids. Beginning with Charles Martellin, the Carolingian Empire had once provided a strong defensive line. In 915, Pope John X worked with the court in Constantinople to form a coalition of Christian princes to expel Muslims from their fortress on the Garagino River. In 941, the Byzantines joined Hugh of Provence, in an attempt to attack a Muslim stronghold at Frejus, though that effort failed due to Hugh's last-minute change of plans. It wasn't until 972 that a coalition of Provençal and Italian princes finally succeeded in removing the threat. However, these military alliances were always local, short-lived, and loosely organized. What was truly needed was a broader or coordinated effort. It was during this time that the powerful Cluniac monastery began to turn its attention toward Spain. Its abbot Odilo, who led Cluny until his death in 1048, and his successor Hugh, who served until 1109, became increasingly involved in Spanish affairs. Cluny had a long-standing concern for the safety and well-being of Christian pilgrims, and was eager to play a role in managing the pilgrimage route to Santiago de Compostela. Helping to secure and defend Christian Spain became a natural extension of that mission. This Cluniac influence likely played a role in the arrival of Roger of Tosny, a Norman knight, who came to the aid of Countess Ursende of Barcelona in 1018 when Muslim forces threatened her territory. Though Roger's own adventurous spirit may also have driven him, his involvement reflected the growing connection between reform-minded monasticism and Christian military action. Under King Sancho and his successors, Cluny's influence over the Spanish Church grew stronger, integrating it into the broader reform movement. As a result, the papacy began to view military efforts to expand Christian territory in Spain with increasing favor. Both the Cluniac order and the papacy gave their blessing to Sancho William of Gascony when he joined forces with Sancho of Navarre to attack the Emir of Saragossa. They also supported Raymond Berenguer, the first of Barcelona, as he advanced southward. Pushing Muslim forces back and reclaiming land for Christendom, the war against non-Christians in Spain began to take on the character of a holy war. Soon even the popes took a direct role in guiding it. In 1063, Ramiro I, the King of Aragon, launched a major offensive against Muslim forces, but was killed by a Muslim warrior at Grados. His death captured the imagination of many in Europe. In response, Pope Alexander II offered an indulgence to anyone who took up arms in Spain under the banner of the cross. He also began raising troops to continue Ramiro's campaign. One of the Pope's Norman soldiers, William of Montreal, recruited fighters in northern Italy. In northern France, Count Ebels of Rusa, brother to Queen Felicia of Aragon, gathered more forces. The largest group came with Geoffrey, Count of Aquitaine, who was placed in command of the expedition. Although they captured the town of Barbastro and seized considerable loot, it was soon lost again. Still, the precedent had been set, and after that, French knights began crossing the Pyrenees in growing numbers to fight. In 1073, Ebels of Russie organized another expedition. Pope Gregory VII invited Christian princes to take part and emphasized that Spain rightfully belonged to the Church of St. Peter. He assured Christian knights that they had the right to claim any lands they recaptured from Muslims. In 1078, Hugh I, Duke of Burgundy, led a force to assist his brother-in-law, Alfonso VI of Castile. 2 years later, Gregory personally endorsed another campaign under Geoffrey's leadership. These efforts began to show results. In 1085, the Christians captured Toledo, a major Muslim stronghold. However, this success provoked a strong Muslim response. The Almoravids, a zealous and powerful Islamic group, reignited the conflict. Beginning in 1087, Christian knights were called urgently to Spain to counter this new threat. Pope Urban II gave his full backing to the cause and even advised would-be pilgrims to Jerusalem that their money would be better spent rebuilding Spanish towns reclaimed from Muslim control. Throughout the late 11th century, Christian warriors from the north continued to join the Spanish campaigns. This wave of crusading enthusiasm continued until the capture of Huesca in 1096 and the final recapture of Barbastro in 1101, which marked the end of that phase of warfare. By the end of the 11th century, the idea of the Holy War had become Huesca reality. Christian knights and soldiers were now being openly encouraged by church leaders to set aside their local feuds and travel to the frontiers of Christendom to fight the non-believers. They were promised the right to keep the lands they reconquered, and they received spiritual rewards for their efforts. However, the exact nature of these spiritual rewards was somewhat unclear. Pope Alexander II seems to have granted indulgences to the campaigners in 1064, while Gregory VII promised forgiveness of sins to those who died fighting under the cross. He had offered the same absolution to those fighting against the excommunicated Emperor Henry IV of Germany. It was now clear that the papacy had assumed control over the organization of these holy wars. The popes often initiated the campaigns, chose their leaders, and insisted that any land taken during the fighting ultimately remain under the authority of the papal see. Although many of the great princes remained hesitant or detached, Western knights were quick to respond to the call of holy war. Their motivations were partly sincere and spiritual. They were tired of fighting one another and wanted, instead, to fight for the cross. But their eagerness was also fueled by a strong desire for land, particularly in northern France, where the system of primogeniture was beginning to take hold. Asterisk. As noble fathers increasingly refused to divide their estates, it became centered around permanent stone castles. Castles' younger sons were left with few prospects at home and had to look elsewhere to make their fortunes. There was a growing restlessness and thirst for adventure among the knightly class, especially among the Normans, who were not far removed from their Viking ancestors, roving warriors and opportunists. The Holy War offered them an appealing combination. The chance to fulfill their Christian duty while also gaining land in the warmer and more fertile regions of the south was a compelling proposition. From the Church's perspective, this new direction for military energy was very promising. If the concept of a holy war worked so well in Spain, might it not be applied to the eastern frontier of Christendom as well? As Muslim rule gradually retreated from Spain, the Pope faced little resistance in asserting his authority over the Church in the newly reclaimed territories. The donation of Constantine, although historically inaccurate, was widely believed to be authentic in the West and gave the Pope secular authority over many regions. Adding the Iberian Peninsula to that list went largely unnoticed. In Spain, there was no significant ecclesiastical power capable of challenging him. In contrast, the structure of the Eastern Church was quite different. The Patriarchates of Alexandria and Antioch, said to have been founded by St. Mark and St. Peter respectively, were just as ancient as the Roman See. Though the Patriarchate of Jerusalem, known as the Church of St. James, was younger, it held the prestige of being located in the holiest city in the Christian world. But it was Constantinople's Patriarchate that stood as Rome's greatest rival. While it couldn't claim the same antiquity, despite its supposed foundation by St. Andrew, Constantinople was considered the new Rome. It had taken the place of the old imperial capital, becoming the center of a continuous line of Christian emperors. It was also the largest and most influential city in Christendom. Its patriarch could rightly consider himself ecumenical, the leading religious authority in the civilized world in Byzantium. Religious dissenters sometimes tried to invoke the authority of Old Rome as a counterbalance to the growing power of the emperor. However, few in the East believed that the bishop of what had become a diminished Western city, often under the sway of unruly nobles or barbarian warlords, had any right to govern churches with such deep-rooted traditions as those in the East. Still, Rome retained a certain reverence, while her claim to supremacy was rejected. She was generally acknowledged to hold a place of honor among the great Christian Caesivon by the ecumenical patriarch. No one questioned the idea that Christendom should remain united. After the Arab conquests, the power of the southern patriarchates diminished significantly, and Constantinople stepped forward as the protector of the Eastern churches. There had been many disputes between Rome and Constantinople over church matters, but none had been as grave or prolonged as later generations imagined. The unity of the Christian world was still largely accepted in the 11th century. However, major reforms reshaped the Roman Church. These changes, influenced by monastic movements from Cluny and Lorraine, were initially implemented by secular rulers who controlled Rome at the time. Emperor Henry III played a particularly active role, and his efforts gave the reform movement enough momentum to continue even after his death. eventually developing independently and even in opposition to secular authorities. Out of this movement came new theories asserting the universal spiritual supremacy of Rome and its ultimate authority over secular rulers. This led to renewed tensions with the East. At the heart of the conflict was Rome's reassertion of its claim to supremacy. But the tensions also arose from doctrinal and ritual differences. In its push to consolidate authority, the papacy sought to enforce uniform practices across the Church. It aimed not only to end clerical marriage for political and spiritual reasons, but also to standardize liturgy and rituals. These changes could be implemented in the West, but Eastern churches followed different traditions. There were Greek-speaking churches within Roman territories, just as there were Latin-speaking ones under Constantinople's influence. In southern Italy, the boundary between the two spheres had long been a matter of dispute. At the same time, German influence in Rome led to the addition of the word filioque in the Nicene Creed, referring to the procession of the Holy Spirit. Unlike earlier popes who had been more willing to compromise or overlook such issues, the reform-minded popes were more rigid and confrontational. Conflict became inevitable. When Pope Sergius IV sent out his official letter of Fythe, formal declaration issued by popes or patriarchs upon their accession, he included the word filioque. In response, Patriarch Sergius II of Constantinople refused to include the pope's name in the diptychs lists of those to be commemorated in liturgy at the patriarchal churches in Constantinople. For the Byzantines, this act implied that the pope personally held unorthodox views on a specific doctrinal point. It did not, however, cast doubt on the orthodoxy of the entire Western Church. But in the West, where the pope was regarded as the very source of orthodox doctrine, the gesture was seen as a broad and serious insult. Eventually, the patriarch recognized that offering to restore the pope's name to the diptychs could be used as a form of negotiation. In 1024, a proposal came from Constantinople to Pope John XIX, suggesting a potential compromise between the churches. The formula was cleverly worded to acknowledge Rome's supremacy in title, while granting Constantinople full autonomy in practice. It suggested that, with the Pope's consent, the Church of Constantinople could be considered universal within its own sphere, just as Rome was universal in the broader sense. John XIX was inclined to accept the offer. However, the abbot of St. Benignus at Dijon, a follower of the Cluniac reform movement, quickly wrote a firm letter warning him. He reminded the Pope that only St. Peter and his successors held the divine authority to bind and loose on earth and in heaven. And he urged John to take a stronger stance in leading the universal church. Byzantium would soon learn that the newly reformed papacy would not tolerate any such compromises. Later in the century, the Norman invasions of southern Italy made a political alliance between the Pope and the Byzantine Emperor seem desirable. However, the reformed papacy was now deeply committed to enforcing uniform practices. It sought to eliminate the Greek customs that were still in use among churches in southern Italy, customs that had even influenced churches further north, as far as Milan. In 1043, Michael Cerularius, a proud and ambitious figure, became the Patriarch of Constantinople. He was just as determined to enforce uniformity within his own domain. His initial goal was to bring the recently acquired Armenian churches into closer alignment with Constantinople, particularly because they followed different customs, such as using unleavened bread in the Eucharist. But his reforms also affected the Latin churches in Byzantine-held southern Italy, as well as the Latin churches in Constantinople itself, which served merchants, pilgrims, and soldiers of the Varangian Guard. When these churches refused to adopt Byzantine practices, Patriarch Cerularius ordered them closed. His court began distributing treatises attacking Latin customs. Michael Cerularius did not seem particularly interested in the deeper theological issues at play. He was willing to restore the Pope's name to the diptychs if Rome agreed to do the same for him. The conflict was primarily about church practices, which brought renewed focus to the long-standing dispute over ecclesiastical boundaries in Italy. Problem made even more urgent by the Norman invasion. The Normans were Latin Christians, and their presence complicated the situation. Negotiations were initiated by Argyros, the governor of Byzantine Italy, a Lombard who remained loyal to Byzantium, but followed the Latin Rite. While the emperor trusted him, Cerularius viewed him with suspicion. Then, events took a dramatic turn. In 1053, before official envoys could be sent from Rome to Constantinople, Pope Leo IX was taken prisoner by the Normans. Despite this setback, a delegation led by Cardinal Humbert of Silva Candida arrived in Constantinople in January 1054 and was welcomed by the emperor. However, Cerularius questioned whether they had truly been appointed by the pope, especially since Leo was in captivity and could not confirm or uphold any agreements. In April, before negotiations progressed, Leo died. This left the legates without official backing. Since a new pope would not be elected for another year, no one knew how the next leader would approach the issue. Cerularius refused to continue discussions. Tensions rose despite the emperor's hope for reconciliation. Eventually, the frustrated legates left Constantinople, but not before placing a bull of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia. It excommunicated Cerularius and his advisors, but explicitly affirmed the orthodoxy of the Byzantine Church as a whole. In response, Cerularius convened a synod that denounced the bull as the act of 3 unauthorized individuals. The synod criticized the filioque addition to the creed and the Western Church's stance against married clergy, but it made no sweeping condemnation of the Roman Church or its other practices. In reality, nothing substantial had changed, except that tensions had flared into lasting resentment. The churches of Alexandria and Jerusalem had no involvement in this dispute. Peter III, the Patriarch of Antioch, believed that Cerularius had been needlessly confrontational. His church continued to include the Pope's name in its diptychs, and saw no reason to stop. He may have suspected that Cerularius, whom he regarded as overly ambitious, aimed to undermine Antioch's independence. Peter likely supported the emperor's more conciliatory approach and resisted the drive for standardized practices, especially since his jurisdiction included churches that followed the Syrian liturgy, many of which lay beyond the empire's political reach. Even if he had wanted to enforce uniformity, it would have been impossible. He chose to remain outside the conflict entirely. Over the next decade, relations between East and West slightly improved. Michael Cerularius was removed from office in 1059, and soon afterward, the Latin churches in Constantinople were reopened. In southern Italy, the Normans, now loyal allies of the papacy since 1059, continued to gain ground, making it unrealistic for Byzantium to assert its religious authority there. In 1061, Roger of Normandy began his conquest of Sicily from the Arabs, a campaign supported by the Pope and seen as a holy war. This further eroded Byzantine influence over local Christian communities by 1073. Emperor Michael VII recognized the need for better relations with Rome. After the Normans captured Bari in 1071, he feared more aggression, and he knew that friendly ties with the papacy might offer protection. At the same time, the Turkoman invasions into Asia Minor had begun, and the emperor urgently needed new troops. Securing support from the West would be easier with Rome's help. That same year, the powerful and respected Cardinal Hildebrand was elected pope. Taking the name Gregory VII, he firmly believed in the supremacy of the Roman See, and therefore did not send the customary letter of faith to the Eastern Patriarchs. Still, Emperor Michael took the initiative and sent Gregory a letter of congratulations, suggesting his openness to closer ties. Gregory, encouraged by this gesture, sent Dominicus, the Patriarch of Grado, as his legate to Constantinople to assess the situation there. After hearing from Dominicus, Gregory VII became convinced that Emperor Michael was sincere in seeking better relations. He also became aware of the worsening situation in Asia Minor. Though pilgrimage to the Holy Land was still technically possible, the Turkoman invasions were rapidly making the overland route through Anatolia unsafe. In response, Gregory conceived a bold new policy, one that reflected both his religious vision and political imagination. He proposed to expand the idea of holy war, which had been gaining momentum in Spain, to apply it to Asia. His allies in Byzantium needed military assistance, and he planned to send an army of Christian knights under the authority of the Church. This time, because religious issues also needed resolving, Gregory intended to lead the campaign himself. His forces would reclaim Asia Minor from the infidels, and afterward, he would convene a great council in Constantinople. There, the Eastern churches united in gratitude would settle their disputes and recognize the supremacy of Rome. Whether Emperor Michael knew about this plan, or whether he would have welcomed it, remains unclear, because Gregory's grand scheme never came to fruition. His unwavering approach to church reform increasingly embroiled him in conflicts across the West, forcing him to abandon his ambitions in the East. Still, he never lost interest in the idea. In 1078, Michael VII was deposed. Gregory responded by excommunicating the new claimant to the throne, Nicephorus Botaniates. Soon after, a man claiming to be the deposed emperor arrived in Italy. The Normans pretended to accept his claim for a time, and Gregory supported him as well. But when Alexius Comnenus replaced Nicephorus in April 1081, Gregory extended the excommunication to Alexius too. In June of that year, Alexius wrote to the Pope, trying to mend relations and seeking help in defending against Robert Guiscard's aggressive campaigns. Gregory, however, did not respond. Left without papal support, Alexius turned instead to Henry IV of Germany, the Pope's political rival. Meanwhile, the emperor shut down the Latin churches in Constantinople. To the Byzantines, it now appeared that the Pope had allied himself with the Normans seen as treacherous and godless invaders. Tales of Gregory's arrogance and unkindness spread throughout the East. When he eventually died, his policies having led to mounting disasters, the news was seen by many as divine judgment. By 1085, the year of Gregory's death, relations between the Eastern and Western churches had reached an all-time low. The Pope had excommunicated the Byzantine Emperor and was encouraging lawless adventurers to attack fellow Christians, while the emperor's government was funding the Pope's chief enemy in Germany. Mistrust and hostility were growing on both sides. Yet, despite all this tension, a formal schism had not yet occurred. Reconciliation was still possible. In Emperor Alexius, the East had a ruler with the flexibility and wisdom of a true statesman. The West, too, was about to produce a leader of equal stature. Odo de Lagri was born around 1042 into a noble family in Châtillon-sur-Marne. For his education, he was sent to the cathedral school at Reims, where his teacher was Saint Bruno, would later go on to found the Carthusian order. Odo remained at Reims after completing his studies, becoming a canon and eventually archdeacon of the cathedral, but he felt unfulfilled. In a sudden change of course, he chose to join the monastic community at Cluny in 1070. He took his vows under Abbot Hugh, who quickly recognized his talent. After serving for a time as prior, Odo was transferred to Rome, where he soon distinguished himself. In 1078, Pope Gregory VII appointed him Cardinal Bishop of Ostia. From 1082 to 1085, he served as papal legate in both France and Germany, turning to Rome to remain with Gregory during the difficult final years of his pontificate. After Gregory's death in exile, while the anti-pope Guibert occupied, the loyal cardinals elected a reluctant and weak choice. The abbot of Monte Cassino became Pope Victor III. The Cardinal of Ostia Odo disapproved of this election and did not hide his opposition. Yet Victor bore no resentment, and on his deathbed in September 1087, recommended Odo as his successor. Gregory VII, too, had reportedly wanted Odo to succeed him. However, it was not until March 1088 that a conclave was able to meet in Terracina and formally elect him as Pope Urban II. Urban was exceptionally well suited to the role. He was tall, dignified, and had a commanding presence, with a bearded face and a courteous, persuasive manner. Though he did not possess Gregory VII's intense drive or fiery determination, he surpassed him in strategic thinking and in his ability to work with people. He was less proud and less rigid than Gregory, but certainly not weak. He had once been imprisoned in Germany because of his loyalty to the papacy and his convictions. While he could be firm and unyielding, he preferred kindness over conflict, and avoided disputes that could lead to bitterness. Urban inherited a troubled position. He could only live safely within Norman-controlled territory and the Normans were notoriously self-serving and unreliable. Rome was still under the control of the anti-pope Guibert. Urban might approach the city's outskirts, but entering Rome itself would mean bloodshed, something he was unwilling to provoke. Further north, Matilda of Tuscany was a staunch supporter of Urban and remained loyal across her vast territories. In 1089, she strengthened her political position through a calculated marriage to Welf of Bavaria, a German prince who was less than half her age. However, in 1091, her forces were defeated by Henry IV of Germany at the Battle of Tricentai. At that point, Henry was at the height of his power. Crowned emperor by the antipope in 1084, he controlled Germany and was dominant in northern Italy. Under such conditions, Urban, with his precarious position, had little chance of securing broader obedience. Still, Urban worked patiently and skillfully. By 1093, the situation had shifted dramatically, without using military force, but through strategic use of resources. He managed to celebrate Christmas that year in Rome, and by spring had taken up residence in the Lateran Palace. Henry IV's power had begun to falter due to the rebellion of his own son Conrad, a rebellion quietly encouraged by Urban, in France, Urban's homeland. He successfully brought the entire church hierarchy under his influence through careful organization. In Spain, his authority was firmly established. Gradually, more distant regions of the West began to recognize his spiritual leadership. Unlike Gregory VII, Urban did not insist on asserting Rome's political dominance over secular rulers. Instead, he showed patience and restraint, even toward many lay leaders, except for those who remained openly hostile. By 1095, Urban II had become the undisputed spiritual leader of Western Christendom. During this time, Urban II turned his attention to the Eastern Church. After Robert Guiscard's death, his brother Roger of Sicily emerged as the leading Norman power. Roger had no interest in further antagonizing Byzantium. With Roger's support, Urban began negotiations with the Byzantine court. At the Council of Melfi in September 1089, held in the presence of ambassadors from Emperor Alexius, Urban lifted the excommunication that had been placed on the emperor. In response, Alexius convened a synod in Constantinople later that same month. It was discovered there that the Pope's name had been left out of the diptychs, not by any formal decision, but more likely by oversight. The synod proposed restoring the Pope's name once a formal letter of faith, a systatic letter, was received from him. The council concluded that there was no substantial reason for discord between the Eastern and Western churches, and recommended seeking the opinions of the patriarchs of Alexandria and Jerusalem. The Patriarch of Antioch was present in person. Patriarch Nicholas III of Constantinople wrote to Urban, informing him of the synod's decisions and requesting that he send his letter within 18 months. He also assured the Pope that the Latin churches in Constantinople were free to follow their own traditions. Notably, no theological disputes were mentioned. However, the emperor's ambassadors in Italy, Basil, Metropolitan of Trani, and Romanus, Archbishop of Rossano, were less enthusiastic. These Greek clerics were disturbed by what they saw as papal overreach into their territories, and were particularly alarmed when Urban asserted, with some historical backing, that his diocese should rightfully include Thessalonica. They would have preferred that Alexius support the anti-pope Guibert, but Alexius had made his decision. He recognized Urban as the legitimate pope and accepted the loss of Byzantine control over southern Italy. Meanwhile, Guibert alienated his Greek allies by holding a council in Rome that condemned clerical marriage. Urban ultimately never sent the requested systatic letter. It's likely because he did not want to stir up theological controversy. As a result, his name was never added to the diptychs in Constantinople. Nevertheless, relations between East and West improved. In 1090, an embassy from Alexius visited Urban, bringing a message of warm friendship. The Byzantine perspective during this time was best expressed in a treatise by Theophylact, Archbishop of Bulgaria. He urged readers not to place too much importance on uniformity of church practices. While he regretted the Latin addition of filioque to the creed, he explained, that this was likely due to the limitations of the Latin language in expressing complex theological ideas. He did not take the Pope's claims of authority over the Eastern churches seriously, and saw no reason why a schism should ever occur. Other Eastern theologians continued to comment on liturgical differences, but their tone remained moderate. One such figure was Simeon II, Patriarch of Jerusalem, who criticized the Latin use of unleavened bread in the Eucharist, but did so without hostility or bitterness.